Alright, so I figured it would be good to explain when it does and does not make sense to test swords on wood, because that's one of the things I do in my reviews. And before I start, because I know that people are going to ask about the strap, what that is, I'm wearing a halter monitor right now that I'm hooked up to, because I've been having some weird problems during gym workouts, and they're trying to figure out if there's something wrong with my heart. Anyway, and the sword that I'm holding here is a Langmesser from Yellow Swords, just so you have something to look at, and because this is one of the next things I'm going to review. So it's totally understandable that many of you cringe when seeing me use swords on thick branches or even small trees. And of course, if you were to grab a sword, even if it's advertised as battle ready, if it's supposed to be functional and everything, and if you take that sucker and you swing it with a lot of force against a mature tree, yeah, chances are you're going to break it. What's the difference? Well, the difference is if you have a fairly large tree trunk, it's not going to move at all. This thing is solid. You might as well just hit a rock. And in fact, one time a smith actually told me he received a broken sword that he made as a return, and he actually found some rock debris in the blade. So somebody was being very smart there. Anyway, so if you're striking a really firm, unyielding, hard object like that, and very dense too, then yes, you are going to mess up the sword, and it's not what it's designed for. Obviously, swords in general are not designed for wood chopping. That's pretty obvious. However, it still makes sense to do these tests, because you want to know if with a certain amount of hard impact, if anything loosens up, if the guard starts to rattle, or if the blade breaks easily because it's improperly hardened and tempered. To give you some specific examples, this right here is what I would consider abusive testing. It's nowhere near as bad as striking a massive oak tree, for example, but it's pretty hard on the sword. And the only reason I did it with those is because they are very high quality sword reproductions. I already know that they are extremely well made, and that's very tough steel and all of that. I was confident that they would handle that kind of abuse, and they did. However, I wouldn't do this kind of thing with a $200 sword. For the most part, there are some exceptions. Some are very much overbuilt. So in this case, you can argue, should a historical sword that is designed for combat, should it be able to withstand that kind of force? I would say yes, because if you think about it, swords clashing together in combat to the death, that's a lot of force going on right there. And there are plenty of techniques where you strike into your opponent's blade. Either you strike it aside and then follow up with your own cut, or you intercept an incoming cut and strike it aside and blow right through that strike and hit your opponent. So that's a lot of force being transferred, a lot of shock, vibration, etc. Also, cutting into bone is, again, bone is quite hard, especially a head, and there are plenty of head strikes shown in the historical manuals. If you strike full force against a skull, don't do that at home, please, by the way. This is just hypothetical, in historical times, the way they fought. That's going to put a lot of stress on the blade and the fittings, the handle, the pommel, etc. So if it's actually called battle ready or functional, etc., what is a functional sword? A sword should be functional for combat. We don't do that anymore nowadays with sharp swords, obviously. That's what we have blunt trainers for. However, that's still what functional means in case of a sword. So if it's functional, it should withstand clashing against other swords, hacking into shields potentially, all of that, a lot of hard use. So I think this kind of test is still fair, even if you can consider it abusive. This kind of thing, on the other hand, those are just thick branches. If a sword cannot handle that, then it is most definitely not functional. This kind of test is perfectly fair, even for a cheaper sword, if it is sold as functional or battle ready, or however you want to call it. Now the difference is that if you hack into a larger log, then the blade gets stopped suddenly. It may lodge itself, especially if there's any kind of twisting motion, and that can put a lot of stress on there. If you get stuck and then it twists and then it starts to vibrate strongly, that's where you can see bending or breaking. A number of people seem to think that the first tests I did with this one here, the Sword of Fëanor by Dark Sword Armory, weren't quite fair. However, if you look at it, this is nowhere near the level of abuse that I put the Albion swords through. Most of those branches or small trees were, for one, they weren't very massive. Most of them were partially rotten and a lot softer than otherwise. In this case here, this was actually softwood, and that's really not very hard on the blade. Also, I cut a few really thin branches and was quite astounded that it didn't cut through all the way. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I would expect a properly sharpened and well-shaped blade to cut through in one strike without any issue. If you look at the footage, you'll see that there's a lot of movement in the target. So be it a branch or a small dead tree, they sway, they have some give. So that's not as tough as cutting into a massive piece of wood that is lodged somewhere and doesn't have anywhere to go. And well, you heard what happened. I still don't quite know for sure what happened. It might be that the tang broke and is kind of wiggling around in there. But what I'm guessing is that the wood is probably expanded, like the tang has worked itself loose a little bit in there. There might be excess space, so that's probably what's moving in there. So I'll still have to... It feels like I'm going to snap this thing any moment. So I'm going to do a few more tests, no more against wood, but some softer targets, and see how that goes. And by the way, on the same day, I also did a few tests with this fantasy cutlass here that one of my subscribers kindly sent me as a gift. This one here is made by Sabersmith, and I was also hacking into wood with this, and some pretty hard swings, and it held up perfectly. There is no wiggle whatsoever. This is very sturdy. So there are plenty of examples of swords that very much take this kind of use in a stride. By the way, for future sword tests, I do plan to do some more appropriate tests with them, meaning tasks that the sword is specifically designed for, meaning parrying an opponent's cut, beating the opponent's blade aside, things like that, using actual historical techniques with those swords, one against the other. It's a little tricky because I basically have to use ideally two swords that are in about the same price range to make it fair, because if I, for example, take one of my Albions and beat up a $200 or $300 sword, that's not going to be quite fair, and the cheaper sword is most likely going to take more damage. But yeah, just wanted to explain that a little bit so you can see the differences and understand why I'm doing this in the first place. There aren't really too many other tests you can do to see exactly how the sword holds up other than martial arts use. Tatami mats, yes, they can show some issues, but if a sword cannot stand up to tatami cutting, then it is seriously flimsy. So some of the underlying problems like rattling hilt, etc., if it's improperly assembled, you're not going to find that with cutting soft targets. You need to go against harder targets. Anyway, let's leave it at that. So thanks for watching and have a good one.